For most of its history, North Korea was famous for empty roads, dark cities, unfinished buildings, and an economy that seemed permanently trapped in the 20th century. But something strange is happening inside the world's most isolated country. Pyongyang is building tens of thousands of new apartments. Smartphone use is expanding. Food delivery services have appeared. Imported cars are filling streets that once had almost no traffic. New restaurants, shopping centers, factories, and luxury districts are being promoted as evidence that North Korea is finally modernizing. Satellite observations also suggest that parts of the country are becoming visibly brighter at night. Even more surprising, outside estimates indicate that North Korea's economy grew by 3.1% in 2023 and another 3.7% in 2024, its fastest expansion in 8 years. Heavy industry grew particularly quickly. Construction accelerated, mining recovered, manufacturing output increased. For a country facing some of the most extensive sanctions in the world, this should not have happened. So, did Kim Jong Un finally discover the secret to economic growth? Not exactly. What happened is much stranger. Kim did not fix North Korea's economy through one brilliant reform. He accidentally benefited from two economic transformations that his government never fully intended to create. The first began when ordinary North Koreans quietly built a market economy underneath the failed socialist one. The second arrived when Russia invaded Ukraine and suddenly became desperate to purchase the one product North Korea had spent 70 years producing in absurd quantities: artillery shells. Together, these two accidents created something almost no economist would have predicted: a totalitarian state using black markets, private investors, old weapons, international sanctions, and a war thousands of kilometers away to engineer an economic recovery. But to understand why this recovery was possible, we need to return to the moment when North Korea's official economy effectively stopped functioning. During the Cold War, North Korea depended heavily on support from the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. Moscow provided fuel, machinery, technology, food, and favorable trade arrangements. North Korean factories could produce goods even when those goods were inefficient or uncompetitive because the socialist bloc kept the system supplied. Then the Soviet Union disappeared, subsidized trade collapsed, fuel imports fell, factories shut down, and agricultural production deteriorated. North Korea's public distribution system, which was supposed to provide food and essential goods to the population, failed across large parts of the country. During the famine of the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of people are believed to have died, although the true number remains unknown. The government did not respond by deliberately creating a market economy. The people did. Families cultivated small private plots. Women began selling food and household goods in improvised markets. Traders carried products across the Chinese border. Workers stopped relying on government salaries that could barely purchase anything. Factory managers quietly sold unused equipment, materials, and production capacity. People bribed officials for permission to travel, trade, manufacture, or avoid their assigned state jobs. These markets became known as Jangmadang. They were technically inconsistent with North Korea's socialist system, but they became essential for survival. The state could condemn private trade in public while depending on it in practice. Every transaction was evidence that central planning had failed, but eliminating those transactions could mean another famine. By the time Kim Jong Un inherited power in late 2011, an entire generation of North Koreans had grown up depending more on markets than on government rations. Kim faced a dangerous choice. He could attempt to restore complete state control, or he could quietly accept an economy that contradicted everything the regime claimed to represent. His father had already demonstrated what could happen when the government attacked the market too aggressively. In 2009, North Korea revalued its currency and placed strict limits on how much old money citizens could exchange. The policy wiped out the savings of traders and families who had accumulated North Korean won. Prices became chaotic, commercial activity was disrupted, and public anger reportedly became unusually intense. The government wanted to eliminate private wealth. Instead, it destroyed confidence in its own currency. North Koreans increasingly stored value in Chinese yuan and American dollars. The lesson was simple: money controlled by the state could disappear overnight. When Kim Jong Un came to power, he did not announce that capitalism had saved North Korea. He did something more politically useful. He left the socialist language in place while allowing capitalist behavior to continue underneath it. Permanent market buildings expanded. Vendors paid fees for stalls. Traders paid for storage, transportation, inspections and permits. Local authorities discovered that a market was easier to tax than to destroy. What had begun as illegal commerce became a source of revenue for the state. Private investors also began working more closely with government institutions. They became known as donju, or masters of money. North Korea still did not legally recognize conventional private ownership, but ownership on paper and control in practice became two different things. A donju might finance new equipment for a state factory, purchase fuel for fishing boats, fund an apartment project, import vehicles, operate a restaurant, or provide capital for a transportation company. The business remained officially connected to a government agency, military unit, or state enterprise. But the final private investor supplied the money and received a share of the profits. Officials provided political protection, investors provided capital, managers provided state-owned assets. Everyone took a percentage. This was corruption, but it also performed a real economic function. In a normal economy, banks collect savings and lend that money to businesses. In North Korea, citizens had little reason to trust state banks, and the formal financial system could not efficiently determine which investments were productive. The donju became an unofficial banking sector. They directed money toward buses, apartments, fisheries, mines, restaurants, workshops, and products that people actually wanted. Kim's government also experimented with incentives inside farms and factories. Some agricultural teams became smaller, and farmers were sometimes allowed to keep or sell more of their production after meeting government obligations. Certain state enterprises gained more freedom to find suppliers, determine wages, sell surplus output, and retain earnings. Implementation was inconsistent, and the state could reverse the rules at any moment, but the economic principle was powerful. When people could benefit personally from producing more, production often increased. This was Kim Jong Un's first accidental solution. He did not invent North Korea's market economy. Desperate citizens had created it without permission. His contribution was recognizing that the regime could exploit the markets instead of constantly trying to eliminate them. During the first several years of his rule, the results were visible. Consumer goods became more widely available to families with money. Private and semi-private transportation expanded. Mobile phone use grew. Restaurants appeared. Construction transformed selected parts of Pyongyang. A new urban class emerged, whose standard of living depended on commerce, investment, and political connections rather than government salaries alone. North Korea had not become capitalist in the legal sense. It had become a hybrid economy. Markets operated at the bottom, connected officials and investors operated in the middle, and the state retained absolute power at the top. This system was more productive than complete central planning, but it remained extremely vulnerable. North Korea still needed imported fuel, machinery, fertilizer, industrial components, and foreign currency. It remained overwhelmingly dependent on China. International sanctions became much more severe after North Korea's nuclear and missile tests, contributing to sharp estimated contractions in 2017 and 2018. Then the pandemic arrived, and Kim sealed the borders. Official trade with China collapsed. Factories lost access to components. Markets lost imported products. Food and essential goods became more difficult to obtain. From 2020 through 2022, outside estimates indicated that the economy contracted again. Kim's market tolerance had made North Korea more adaptable, but it had not solved the country's most basic problem. North Korea had very little that the outside world was both willing and legally permitted to buy. Then, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The war created an extraordinary mismatch. Russia possessed one of the largest military-industrial systems in the world, but the conflict consumed artillery ammunition faster than Russian factories could replace it. Western sanctions also restricted Moscow's access to technology, equipment, financing, and international suppliers. North Korea had the opposite problem. It was economically isolated and desperately needed food, fuel, fertilizer, machinery, and foreign resources. But it had spent decades manufacturing and stockpiling enormous quantities of Soviet-standard artillery ammunition in preparation for a war on the Korean peninsula that never came. Suddenly, the most economically isolated country in the world had exactly what one of the world's largest military powers urgently needed. North Korea and Russia even shared compatible ammunition standards. Shells stored for decades in North Korean bunkers could be shipped directly into Russia's military supply chain. Reports suggest that millions of artillery rounds, rockets, missiles, and other military products began moving from North Korea toward Russia. Pyongyang also sent thousands of soldiers and workers to support Russia's war effort and broader labor needs. In the alleged return, North Korea could receive fuel, food, fertilizer, raw materials, construction supplies, military technology, and other forms of assistance. Estimates of the total value vary enormously because both countries have powerful reasons to conceal the arrangement. Some assessments place North Korea's compensation in the billions of dollars. Even the lower estimates would be transformative for an economy as small as North Korea's. An external windfall of approximately $10 billion would be proportionally similar to the United States suddenly discovering several trillion dollars in new foreign demand. This was Kim Jong Un's second accidental solution. For 70 years, North Korea's obsession with war had diverted labor, steel, chemicals, energy, and capital away from civilian development. Its warehouses of artillery shells represented decades of economic waste. They were products built at enormous cost, stored underground, and never used. Then a war in Europe turned that waste into one of the most valuable assets North Korea possessed. But here is where the apparent economic miracle becomes more complicated. Selling billions of dollars in artillery shells does not necessarily mean North Korea produced billions of dollars in new output. To understand why, consider how gross domestic product is calculated. GDP measures the value of final goods and services produced inside an economy during a particular period. One common formula adds household consumption, business investment, government spending, and exports, then subtracts imports. When a factory produces an item that has not yet been sold, that item still counts toward GDP. It is recorded as an increase in inventory. If a refrigerator factory builds a refrigerator in December and sells it in January, the refrigerator counts as production in December, not January. The same principle applies to artillery shells. If North Korea manufactured a shell in 1985 and stored it inside a mountain, that shell should theoretically have counted as production in 1985. Selling it to Russia today raises exports, but it also reduces inventory by the same amount. One number rises while the other falls. The effects largely cancel each other out. If North Korea receives Russian goods in exchange, those goods are imports, which are subtracted when calculating GDP. In strict accounting terms, trading an old shell for newly imported fuel might produce little direct increase in current North Korean output. This creates a fascinating contradiction. North Korea could receive the largest commercial windfall in its history, while some of the transaction barely appears as new GDP. But people do not live inside accounting formulas. A shell sitting in a bunker cannot feed a family, power a truck, fertilize a field, or construct an apartment. If North Korea exchanges that shell for food, diesel, fertilizer, machinery, and building materials, the country becomes economically better off, even if the original export is offset by declining inventory. More importantly, those imported resources can activate new domestic production. Fuel allows trucks and agricultural equipment to operate. Fertilizer can raise farm output. Raw materials keep factories running. Construction supplies allow new apartments and industrial facilities to be built. Imported components make consumer goods and transportation services possible, and North Korea is not merely emptying old warehouses. It more in your kind of fordersend. It mortisch kon fordunyaftsing. It mortisch kon nemtarpentine strinelburka. Can manufacture more ammunition. That is where the boom becomes genuine new production. Outside estimates suggest that North Korea's heavy and chemical industries expanded by more than 10% in 2024. Factories that had struggled with limited demand suddenly received orders from a customer consuming artillery shells at an extraordinary rate. Mines supplied inputs, metalworking plants increased output, transportation networks moved goods toward the Russian border. Workers were redirected into military production. The first stage of the opportunity converted old inventory into useful imports. The second stage stimulated new industrial production. The third stage used the imported resources to support construction, consumption, and selected civilian activity. This helps explain the highly visible transformation of Pyongyang. Kim's government has pursued an ambitious program to build tens of thousands of apartments in the capital, including new districts with towers, shops, services, and public facilities. One showcase district added approximately 10,000 apartments as part of a broader plan to construct 50,000 homes. The symbolism is almost too perfect. Some of the new towers resemble the missiles for which their districts are named. North Korea is quite literally converting the products of militarization into a display of modernization. But Russia is providing more than demand. It is also providing political protection. North Korea has faced United Nations sanctions since its first nuclear test in 2006. These restrictions cover weapons, minerals, luxury products, petroleum imports, financial activity, overseas workers, and other important sources of revenue. For years, a United Nations panel investigated violations and published evidence about sanctions evasion. In 2024, Russia used its position on the United Nations Security Council to end the mandate of that monitoring panel. The sanctions did not disappear, but one of the most important mechanisms for documenting violations was removed. This made Russia's friendship an economic asset in itself. Moscow became a customer, supplier, strategic partner, and political shield. China completes the arrangement. Beijing has always wanted North Korea to survive as a buffer between China and South Korea, where tens of thousands of American troops are stationed. But China also trades far more with the United States, Europe, Japan, and South Korea than it does with Pyongyang. It has historically tried to keep North Korea alive without openly accepting every provocation, and in new geopolitical environment gives all three countries something they need. Russia wants ammunition and labor, North Korea wants resources, technology, and protection. China wants access to discounted Russian commodities while preventing instability on the Korean peninsula. Goods, energy, military products, and political favors can move through this relationship even when conventional banking channels are unavailable. The result is not simply an alliance, it is an economic ecosystem built by countries attempting to reduce their dependence on Western institutions. And this is where the two accidental transformations connect. Russia could provide North Korea with resources, but resources alone do not guarantee economic activity. The Soviet Union supported North Korea for decades, yet the system eventually collapsed because central planners could not allocate goods efficiently. What makes the current moment different is that North Korea now possesses the semi-market economy created after the famine. When fuel, components, and consumer products enter the country, traders can distribute them. Donju can finance businesses that use them. Transportation networks can move them. Restaurants, workshops, construction projects, and semi-private enterprises can transform them into income. Local officials can tax them. The state can reward loyal groups without personally managing every cent. Transaction. Russia supplied the windfall, but the hidden market economy gave North Korea a mechanism for circulating part of it. Without the Jangmadang, the new resources might have remained trapped inside government warehouses. Without the Jangmadang, there would be fewer investors capable of turning imported materials into apartments, vehicles, workshops and services. Without the limited reforms of the Kim era, factory managers would have less reason to respond to new demand. Kim did not accidentally fix the economy once. He benefited from two separate accidents. First, ordinary North Koreans built capitalism underneath socialism. Then Vladimir Putin created an enormous market for North Korea's most useless stockpile. Together, they made the system more functional than it had been in decades. But more functional does not mean prosperous, and it certainly does not mean free. Much of the visible boom is concentrated in Pyongyang and a small number of favored cities. Satellite lighting may be increasing, but the gains are distributed unevenly. Rural communities still face weak infrastructure, limited electricity, poor healthcare, and food insecurity. The average North Korean remains dramatically poorer than the average South Korean. The new cars, apartments, smartphones, and restaurants also reveal rising inequality. Access depends on money, political status, geography, and connections to the regime. North Korea once claimed to represent revolutionary equality. Its current system is closer to authoritarian crony capitalism, where wealth is tolerated as long as it remains dependent on political loyalty. The same technology that creates limited independence can also strengthen government control. A smartphone allows someone to communicate, find information, arrange transportation, and participate in commerce. But a phone operating on a state-controlled network can also be monitored. A smart television can deliver entertainment and advertising, but it can also deliver propaganda. A modern apartment can improve living standards, but it can also be allocated as a reward for obedience. Kim has discovered that consumerism does not necessarily weaken a dictatorship. If the state controls who receives the rewards, consumption can become another method of discipline. The recovery also depends heavily on a single customer engaged in a single war. That is an extremely fragile economic foundation. Wars eventually slow down or end. Russia could reduce its demand for ammunition. North Korea's old stockpiles could deteriorate or run low. Its factories may struggle to replace shells as quickly as Russia consumes them. Equipment is old. Electricity is unreliable and production capacity is limited. Even if military exports continue, they cannot replace the legal trade, investment, technology and financial integration required for long-term development. North Korea is effectively borrowing prosperity from the past. Other countries borrow from the future by accumulating debt. North Korea is drawing down a 70-year inheritance of weapons produced by previous generations. For one unusual moment in history, those weapons became extraordinarily valuable, but inherited stockpiles eventually disappear. There is an even deeper risk. The windfall may reduce pressure for genuine reform. If Kim can obtain food, fuel, technology, and foreign resources by selling weapons, he has less reason to open the economy, improve property rights, normalize international relations, or reduce military spending. The economic recovery could make North Korea more stable while making meaningful modernization less likely. That is why saying Kim Jong Un fixed the economy requires quotation marks. He did not build independent courts, trustworthy banks, secure contracts, transparent institutions, or competitive companies. He built a system capable of surviving without them. Markets compensate for the failures of state distribution. Donju compensate for the failures of banks. Bribes compensate for the absence of predictable regulations. China compensates for the absence of normal trade. Russia compensates for the absence of legal export markets. Weapons compensate for the absence of competitive civilian industries. Every solution keeps the system alive without correcting the reason the solution was needed. And yet, from the perspective of regime survival, that may be precisely the point. Kim Jong Un does not need North Korea to become rich. He needs it to produce enough food to prevent collapse, enough consumer goods to reward the elite, enough weapons to deter foreign intervention, and enough economic opportunity to keep politically important groups loyal. By that standard, the hybrid economy has been remarkably effective. The phenomenal question is not whether North Korea's economy is truly fixed. It is what will remain when Russia no longer needs millions of shells. Kim Jong Un may have accidentally fixed North Korea's economy, but what he truly fixed was the regime's ability to survive an economy that remains fundamentally broken.